Close your eyes and let your mind drift back through the veils of time, beyond the roar of modern engines and the flicker of neon lights. Imagine a world where the air is thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. You are standing on the banks of the Tiber River in central Italy, nearly 3,000 years ago. The water flows with a soft, rhythmic pulse, a liquid ribbon of silver, under a moon that has watched over the rise and fall of countless empires. Before the marble temples, before the grand colosseums, and before the paved roads that would one day lead to the ends of the earth, there were only the hills. 7 hills, cloaked in emerald forests and golden grasses, waiting for a story to begin. This is not just a history. It is a dream of a city that refused to die. As we walk through the mist of the 8th century BCE, let the weight of the day fall away. You are safe in the silence of the past. Our story does not actually begin in Italy, but in the burning ruins of a distant city, Troy. To understand Rome, one must understand the Roman need for a divine lineage. Imagine the hero Aeneas, son of the goddess Venus, carrying his elderly father on his back through the smoke of a fallen kingdom. He was a man of destiny, guided by the stars across the Mediterranean until he reached the shores of Latium. For centuries, his descendants ruled in the quiet city of Alba Longa. It was a place of tradition and peace, until the shadow of human greed darkened the throne. King Numitor was deposed by his brother, Amulius, a man whose heart was as cold as the iron he wielded. Amulius sought to end Numitor's line forever. He forced Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin, vowing her to a life of solitude so she might never bear a child who could challenge his crown. But the gods have their own designs, indifferent to the schemes of mortal men. Imagine a sacred grove, where the sunlight filters through the leaves in shafts of pale gold. Rhea Silvia sat by a spring, the silence broken only by the chirping of cicadas. It was here that Mars, the god of war, descended in a mantle of shadow and flame. From this divine union, 2 twin boys were born, Romulus and Remus. When King Amulius learned of their birth, his fear turned to cruelty. He ordered the infants to be cast into the Tiber River. Picture the small wicker basket, bobbing precariously on the churning gray waters of a flooding river. The current was fierce, yet strangely protective. The river god Tiberinus calmed the waves, guiding the basket toward the shore, where it became entangled in the roots of a wild fig tree. The Ficus ruminalis at the foot of the Palatine Hill. The cry of the hungry infants echoed through the woods, reaching the ears of a creature that should have been their predator, but became their savior, a magnificent she-wolf, with fur the color of storm clouds and eyes like polished amber, emerged from the shadows. In one of history's most enduring images of tenderness, she did not growl. She knelt. She allowed the future founders of the greatest empire on earth to nurse from her, providing them with the strength of the wild. Soon, a gentle shepherd named Faustulus discovered the scene. He took the boys home to his wife, Acca Laurentia, and they raised them in a simple hut made of straw and clay. The boys grew up as men of the earth, hardy, brave, and deeply connected to the rugged landscape of the 7 hills. They were leaders among the shepherds, hunters of bandits, and protectors of the weak. Unaware that the blood of gods and kings flowed through their veins, years passed, and the secret of their birth was finally revealed. Romulus and Remus returned to Alba Longa, overthrew the tyrant Emulus, and restored their grandfather Numitor to his rightful throne. But the twins were not content to live in the shadows of their ancestors. They yearned to build a city of their own, on the very spot where the she-wolf had found them. This is where the dream turns to tragedy, reminder that Rome was born from both ambition and blood. Romulus chose the Palatine Hill, the site of their rescue. Remus preferred the Aventine. They sought a sign from the gods, watching the flight of vultures across the vast, open sky. Remus saw 6 birds first. Romulus saw 12 later. The disagreement turned into a bitter argument. As Romulus began to dig the sacred trench, to Pomerium and build a modest stone wall, Remus mocked him. In a moment of fatal hubris, Remus leaped over the wall, laughing at how easily a city could be invaded. Romulus, consumed by a protective rage for his new creation, struck his brother down. "So perish all who shall overleap my walls," he declared. Romulus was now alone. The city was named Roma, after its solitary founder. On the 21st of April, 753 BCE, the first stone of an eternal story was laid. The early city was not a place of marble, but a sanctuary for the restless. Romulus understood that a city needed people. He declared the Capitoline Hill an asylum, a place where anyone, the runaway slave, the political exile, the wandering debtor could find a new beginning. Imagine the flickering torches of those first campfires. Men from all over Italy gathered around Romulus. They were rugged, desperate, and fiercely loyal. But they lacked the one thing a lasting society requires: families. This led to the famous and controversial rape of the Sabine women, an event where the Romans invited their neighbors to a festival and abducted their daughters to be their wives. While this began in strife, the story tells us that the women eventually stepped between the clashing armies of their fathers and their new husbands, pleading for peace. They chose to stay, and in doing so, they merged two peoples into one. This was the first lesson of Rome, the power of integration. Rome would not be a city of one tribe, but a melting pot of many. As the first king, Romulus did more than just fight. He was the architect of the Roman soul. He selected 100 of the eldest and wisest men to be his advisors. He called them the Paters, the Fathers, and their council became the Senate. Their descendants would be known as the patricians, the aristocratic backbone of Rome. The rest of the people were the plebeians. This dual structure, the tension and cooperation between the elite and the commoners, would define Roman politics for the next 1,000 years. Romulus also organized the first legions, dividing the men into units of thousands. He created a society where every citizen was a soldier, and every soldier was a farmer. This balance of the sword and the plow gave Rome a stability that its neighbors lacked. As Romulus's reign drew to a close, legend says he did not die an ordinary death. During a violent thunderstorm, while reviewing his troops, a thick cloud descended and swept him up into the heavens. He was deified as the god Quirinus, the divine protector of the Roman people. With the disappearance of Romulus, a profound silence fell over the hills. The Romans had their city and their soldiers, but they lacked a moral compass. They needed someone to teach them how to speak to the gods, how to live in harmony, and how to govern with law rather than the spear. This brought forth the second king, Numa. Numa was a Sabine, a man of deep piety and quiet wisdom who preferred the solitude of the groves to the noise of the forum. Under his long and peaceful reign, the raw energy of Romulus was tempered. He established the religious foundations of the state, creating the office of the Pontifex Maximus and the College of the Vestal Virgins, whose task was to keep the sacred fire of Rome burning eternally. He taught the Romans that the favor of the gods was not won through mindless sacrifice, but through ritual, order, and the keeping of oaths. It was during these years of peace that the Roman calendar was refined, giving a rhythm to the passing of seasons and the duties of the people. But peace is often a fragile interlude in the story of Rome. The kings who followed Tullus, Hostilius, and Ancus, Marcius returned the city to its expansionist roots. Hostilius was a man of fire, a warrior king who believed that the comfort of peace was making the Romans soft. He destroyed the ancient city of Alba Longa, forcing its people to move to Rome, thereby doubling the city's population and its military might. Ancus Marcius, his successor, struck a balance between the two extremes. He was a builder who constructed the first bridge across the Tiber, the Pons Sublicius, and established the port of Ostia, ensuring that Rome would never be an isolated hill town, but a gateway to the sea and the world beyond. The final era of the kings saw the rise of the Etruscan influence. The Tarquin kings brought with them the sophisticated engineering and art of the north. They transformed the physical landscape of the city, draining the marshy valleys between the hills with the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer, to create the Roman Forum, the beating heart of public life. They built the massive temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, a symbol of Rome's growing ambition to stand as the capital of the world. It was during this time that Servius Tullius, perhaps the most brilliant of the later kings, instituted the census. By organizing the people based on their wealth and ability to provide military equipment, he created the centuries. This was a masterstroke of political engineering. It gave every citizen a stake in the survival of the state, while ensuring that those with the most to lose bore the greatest responsibility for its defense. Yet, as the city grew in stone and structure, the character of its kings began to decay. The final king, Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud, ruled through fear and arrogance. He ignored the Senate, executed his rivals, and treated the Roman people as his personal servants. As the dust of the revolution settled and the last of the kings vanished into the shadows of history, a new dawn broke over the Seven Hills. The year was 509 BCE, and the people of Rome breathed the air of a new reality. They called it the res publica, the public affair. It was a bold, untried experiment, a state that belonged not to a single master, but to the people themselves. Imagine the Roman Forum in these early years, a bustling valley of sun-drenched stone and earthen paths, where the collective voice of a nation began to find its rhythm. The Romans had sworn that no one man would ever rule them again, and to ensure this, they divided the power of the old kings between two men, called consuls. These leaders were elected for only 1 year, each holding the power to veto the other. This was the birth of Roman balance, a system designed to keep ambition in check through the constant, watchful eyes of a peer. Yet, beneath the surface of this new freedom, a deep and ancient tension remained. The city was divided not by stone walls, but by blood and status. On one side stood the patricians, the noble families who traced their ancestry back to the original senators of Romulus. They held the priesthoods, the legal knowledge, and the seats of power. On the other side were the plebeians, the farmers, the craftsmen, and the soldiers who formed the backbone of the Roman legions. For decades, the plebeians felt like strangers in their own city, fighting Rome's wars but having no voice in its laws. The story of their struggle is one of the most remarkable chapters in the human journey toward justice. In 494 BCE, tired of being ignored, the plebeian soldiers did something revolutionary. They simply walked away. They marched out of the city and gathered on the sacred mount, refusing to fight or work until their rights were recognized. Imagine the silence in Rome that day, the empty workshops, the quiet barracks, the sudden realization among the elite that a city cannot survive without the hands that build it. This secession of the plebs forced the patricians to compromise. From this conflict emerged the tribunes of the plebs, sacred officials who carried the power to stand in the path of any magistrate and cry out a single, world-changing word: veto, I forbid. Slowly, the laws were carved into bronze tablets and displayed in the Forum for all to see, ensuring that justice was no longer a secret kept by the few, but a shield for the many. As the internal heart of Rome found its balance, the city's eyes turned outward. The Republic was no longer a small town on the Tiber. It was becoming a regional power, and soon it would face its greatest test. Across the blue expanse of the Mediterranean sat the glittering city of Carthage, a maritime empire of immense wealth and ancient Phoenician heritage. For centuries, Carthage had ruled the waves, but as Rome expanded through Italy, the two giants eventually stood face to face. This began the Punic Wars, a series of epic struggles that would determine the fate of the Western world. Picture the Mediterranean Sea, not as a vacation destination, but as a vast, turbulent battlefield. In the first of these wars, the Romans, traditionally a people of the land, had to learn how to fight on the water. They captured a wrecked Carthaginian ship, took it apart, piece by piece, and rebuilt a fleet of their own. They turned a naval battle into a land battle by inventing the corvus, a spiked boarding bridge that allowed their soldiers to swarm onto enemy decks. It was a testament to the Roman spirit. They did not just endure obstacles, they engineered their way through them. But the most legendary challenge was yet to come. Imagine the biting cold of the high Alps, the wind howling through jagged peaks where the air is thin and the path is treacherous. Through this frozen wilderness marched Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general who had sworn eternal hatred against Rome. He led an army of thousands, accompanied by massive war elephants, over the mountains and down into the heart of Italy. For 15 years, Hannibal moved through the Italian countryside like a ghost, winning brilliant victories and bringing the Republic to the very edge of extinction. At the Battle of Cannae, Rome lost the largest army it had ever assembled in a single day. The city was in mourning. The gates were barred. Yet, it was in this darkest hour that the character of the Republic truly shone. While any other nation might have surrendered, the Romans refused to even discuss peace. They called upon their last reserves, arming the young and the old. They found a leader in Scipio Africanus, a man who realized that to defeat Hannibal, he must strike at the heart of Carthage itself. In 202 BCE, on the plains of Zama, in North Africa, the two greatest generals of the age finally met. Scipio's victory did more than just end the war. It shifted the center of gravity of the ancient world. Carthage was humbled, and the Mediterranean became a Roman lake. With the fall of Carthage, the Republic entered a golden age of expansion, but it was a path laden with unintended consequences. Gold, slaves, and art flowed into Rome from the conquered east and west. The simple, rugged city of brick and wood began to transform into a metropolis of marble and wealth. The Senate, once a council of elders advising on survival, was now the most powerful governing body in the world. Imagine the senators in their white togas with purple borders, debating the fate of kingdoms as far away as Greece and Asia Minor. Their authority rested on oak Toratassa, blend of prestige, tradition, and the weight of their ancestors' achievements. However, the very success of the Republic began to erode its foundations. The wealth of empire did not flow equally. Small farmers, the men who had fought the wars of expansion, returned home to find their lands swallowed up by the vast estates of the wealthy. The gap between the rich and the poor widened into a chasm, and the old spirit of cooperation between the orders began to dissolve into bitterness and violence. The struggle was no longer just about rights. It was about survival and power. As the centuries of the Republic drew toward their close, the system of checks and balances began to strain under the weight of massive armies and ambitious generals. Men like Marius, Sulla, and eventually Julius Caesar realized that the loyalty of a soldier was no longer to the Senate, but to the commander who provided them with land and loot. The quiet, orderly debates of the Forum were increasingly replaced by the clatter of iron and the march of boots. The Republic had grown too large for its own ancient laws. It had conquered the world, but in doing so, it had lost the ability to govern itself. Yet, even in its final decades, the Republic remained a place of towering intellect and profound philosophy. Cicero, the great orator, filled the air with the music of the Latin language, defending the idea of liberty and the rule of law, even as the shadows of autocracy lengthened. As we leave the Republic and drift toward the era of the emperors, let us remember it not just as a time of war, but as a time of profound human creation. It was the Republic that gave us the concept of the citizen, the idea of the public good, and the belief that laws should be written down for all to see. The Roman Republic was a bridge between the ancient world of kings and the modern world of states, a sprawling, chaotic, and magnificent dream of a people who believed that they were the masters of their own destiny. The long, blood-stained shadows of the civil wars finally began to retreat, leaving behind a Rome that was exhausted, hollowed out, and yearning for nothing more than the simple grace of stability. The air in the Forum, once electric with the fiery oratory of Cicero and the clashing ambitions of Caesar and Pompey, now held a heavy, expectant silence. The Republic, as it had been known for 5 centuries, had breathed its last in the chaos of assassinations and battlefield slaughter. But from the ashes of that old world emerged a figure who would become the master of a new one. He was young, soft-spoken, and moved with a cold, calculating precision. His name was Octavian, but the world would come to know him as Augustus, the revered one. Imagine the city of Rome in the year 27 BCE. The sun rises over the Capitoline Hill, but the light feels different. There is no longer the frantic scramble for power between rival generals. Instead, there is a singular, quiet authority. Augustus was a genius of the unspoken. He knew that the Roman people still cherished the ghost of the Republic and hated the word king with a primal intensity. So, he performed a masterful act of political theater. He stood before the Senate and offered to lay down all his powers, to return the state to the hands of the fathers. In the Senate, well aware that the alternative was a return to the nightmare of civil war, begged him to stay. He accepted, not as a dictator or a monarch, but as the princeps, the first citizen. This was the great compromise that birthed the Roman Empire. On the surface, the Senate still met, the consuls were still elected, and the ancient rituals were still performed. But beneath that thin veil of tradition, every string was pulled by one hand. Augustus held the power of the tribunes to protect the people, and the power of the proconsuls to command the legions. He had turned the Republic into a mask for an autocracy, but it was a mask so beautifully crafted and so peaceful that the world was more than happy to wear it. Under Augustus, the very texture of Rome began to change. He famously boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Imagine walking through the streets during this golden dawn. The sound of chisels hitting stone echoes through the valleys as grand new forums, theaters, and temples rise toward the sky. The era passes. The altar of Augustan peace was carved with intricate vines and processions of peaceful families, a silent stone testament to the end of slaughter. Augustus established the first professional fire brigade, the first police force, and a postal system that allowed messages to fly across the vast distances of the empire. He was not just building a government. He was building a civilization that felt eternal. This era marked the beginning of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For the next 200 years, a relative tranquility settled over the Mediterranean like a warm summer evening. It was a time when a traveler could, in theory, walk from the fog-drenched forests of Britain to the sun-scorched sands of the Euphrates without ever leaving the protection of Roman law or stepping off a Roman road. Imagine those roads straight as an arrow, paved with heavy stone, cutting through mountains and bridging roaring rivers. They were the veins of the empire, carrying not just soldiers, but ideas, religions, and exotic goods. In the harbors of Ostia and Alexandria, massive ships with white sails brought grain from Egypt, silk from the East, and spices that filled the air with the scent of cinnamon and cloves. The Mediterranean was no longer a barrier. It was a highway, cleared of pirates and guarded by the Roman fleet. This was a world of connection. In the grand cities of the East, Greek philosophy mingled with Roman administration. In the West, tribal chieftains put down their swords, put on the toga, and began to build bathhouses and amphitheaters. To be Roman was no longer just an ethnicity. It was an identity, a shared way of life defined by the hum of the market, the steam of the public baths, and the spectacle of the games. As the years drifted by, the mantle of the princeps passed from one hand to the next. Some were men of shadows and cruelty, like the reclusive Tiberius or the erratic Nero, reminding the world that absolute power is a heavy and dangerous burden. but even during the reigns of the mad emperors. The vast machinery of the Roman bureaucracy, the governors, the tax collectors, and the Stoic centurions kept the wheels of the empire turning. The Pax Romana was stronger than the flaws of any one man. The empire reached its physical and spiritual zenith during the era of the 5 good emperors. This was a time when the throne was not passed through birth, but through adoption, ensuring that the most capable man led the state. Imagine the empire under Trajan, the Optimus Princeps, as the legions pushed the borders to their absolute limit, reaching the shores of the Persian Gulf. Then came Hadrian, the restless traveler and architect, who spent his years wandering the provinces, building his great wall in the north of Britain, and redesigning the Pantheon in Roma. Dome so perfect it seemed to hold the entire sky within its embrace. Following him was the quiet, dutiful Antoninus, pious, and finally, the philosopher King Marcus Aurelius. Imagine Marcus Aurelius in the twilight of this golden age. He did not spend his days in the luxury of a palace, but in a military tent on the cold, damp frontiers of the Danube. By the light of a flickering lamp, he wrote his meditations, not for an audience, but for himself. He reflected on the fleeting nature of life, the duty one owes to the human community, and the importance of maintaining a calm, rational mind in a world of constant change. He was the personification of the Roman ideal, a man who held the power of life and death over millions, yet viewed himself as a mere servant of the cosmic order. But as Marcus Aurelius wrote his thoughts in the silence of the night, the first tremors of a distant storm were beginning to be felt. The Pax Romana, which had felt as permanent as the sun itself, was beginning to fray at the edges. Plagues brought back by the legions began to thin the population, and the pressure of migratory tribes on the borders began to grow. The long afternoon of Rome was moving toward a sunset that no one was yet prepared to see. Yet, in this span of nearly 2 centuries, the early empire had accomplished something miraculous. It had created a unified world. It had laid down the legal codes that would form the basis of Western justice. It had spread a language that would evolve into the songs of the Romance tongues. It had built the aqueducts that still stand today as skeletons of a giant age. As the light fades on the era of the good emperors, we see a Rome that has moved far beyond the hill fort of Romulus. It has become an idea, dream of order, law, and peace that would haunt the imagination of the world for all the centuries to come. The death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE marked more than just the end of a reign. It was the closing of a door on the long, golden afternoon of the Pax Romana. As the philosopher king's life faded, the stoic calm that had held the empire together began to unravel. His son, Commodus, was a man of a different spirit, erratic, obsessed with the spectacle of the arena, and indifferent to the delicate dance of governance. Under his rule, the cracks that had been hidden by the prestige of the 5 good emperors began to widen, and the empire started its long descent into a century of shadow, fire, and near extinction. This was the crisis of the 3rd century, a time when the very heart of Rome nearly stopped beating. Imagine a world where the sun still rises over the same marble temples and paved roads, but the air is thick with a new kind of anxiety. The steady pulse of the empire, its law, its currency, and its borders began to falter. The first and most visible wound was the breakdown of political order. For 50 years, the throne of the Caesars became a prize to be seized by the sword, rather than a duty to be inherited or bestowed by the Senate. This was the era of the barracks emperors, men who were raised to power on the shields of their soldiers one day, only to be cut down by those same soldiers the next. Imagine the confusion of a citizen in a distant province, hearing news of a new emperor in the morning, only to learn by dusk that he had already been replaced by another. In a span of just 5 decades, more than 26 men laid claim to the title of Augustus, and almost all of them met a violent end, as the center failed to hold. The frontiers began to groan under the weight of a world in motion. To the north, the Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Vandals, and the Alemanni were no longer small, scattered bands. They had grown into powerful confederations, drawn by the wealth of the empire and pushed by mysterious migrations from the deep east. Imagine the cold, misty banks of the Danube and the Rhine, where the once impregnable line of Roman forts now stood thin and undermanned. To the east, a new and revitalized power arose, the Sassanid Persians. They were not merely raiders, but a sophisticated empire that sought to reclaim the glory of old. And for the first time in history, a Roman Emperor Valerian was captured in battle and held as a trophy by a foreign king. The empire was not just being attacked from without, it was rotting from within. A devastating plague, the plague of Cyprian, swept through the provinces, thinning the ranks of the farmers who grew the grain and the soldiers who guarded the walls. With fewer hands to work the land and more soldiers to pay, the Roman economy began a terrifying freefall to meet the soaring costs of war. The emperors did something that felt small at first, but proved catastrophic. They debased the currency. They took the silver denarius, the coin that had fueled Mediterranean trade for centuries, and mixed it with cheap copper. Imagine a merchant in a bustling market in Antioch or Lyon, holding a coin that looks like silver, but feels light and dull. As the silver content dropped to less than 5%, prices skyrocketed. This was hyperinflation on a grand scale. People lost faith in money and returned to the ancient ways of bartering, exchanging a sack of wheat for a pair of sandals, or a jar of oil for a day's labor. The complex, interconnected world of Roman trade began to shrink into local pockets of survival. The Great Sea, once a highway of commerce, became a place of silence and piracy at its lowest point. Around the year 260 CE, the Roman Empire literally fell apart. It shattered into 3 separate pieces. In the west, the provinces of Gaul, Spain, and Britain broke away to form the Gallic Empire, seeking to protect themselves since Rome no longer could. In the east, the desert city of Palmyra, under the brilliant and defiant Queen Zenobia, seized control of the vital grain supplies of Egypt and the trade routes of Syria. The central Roman state was left as a hollow shell, surrounded by enemies and betrayed by its own provinces. It seemed, to any observer of the time, that the story of Rome was over. But the Roman spirit possessed a strange, stubborn resilience. From the rugged provinces of the Balkans came a series of Illyrian emperors, hard, professional soldiers who had spent their entire lives in the camps. They cared little for the luxuries of the city or the traditions of the Senate. They cared only for the survival of the state. The most remarkable among them was Aurelian. Imagine a man who spent almost every moment of his 5-year reign on the back of a horse, galloping from one end of the empire to the other. He was a whirlwind of steel and discipline. He defeated the Germanic invaders. He marched east to dismantle the Palmyrene Empire, and he turned west to bring the Gallic provinces back into the fold. For his Herculean efforts, the Senate granted him a title that was as much a prayer as an honor, Restitutor Orbista, restorer of the world. Aurelian gave Rome a second chance. But it was Diocletian, rising to power in 284 CE, who redesigned the empire so it could actually function in this dangerous new reality. Diocletian looked at the sprawling map of Rome and realized that it was too big for one man to govern and too fragile for one man to defend. He did the unthinkable. He divided the empire's administration. He created the tetrarchy, the rule of 4, with 2 senior emperors and 2 junior ones, each responsible for a different corner of the world. Imagine the change in the atmosphere of power. The emperor was no longer the first citizen of Augustus's time. He became the dominus, the lord. Diocletian surrounded himself with the elaborate ceremonies of the East, wearing silken robes and requiring those who approached him to prostrate themselves. This was no longer a mask of the Republic. It was a blatant military autocracy. He fixed prices, reformed the tax system, and reorganized the army into mobile strike forces. He saved the empire, but the cost was the final disappearance of the old Roman freedom. The state became a machine, rigid and heavy, designed for one purpose: to endure. As the 3rd century closed, the storm had passed, but the landscape was forever changed. The cities were now encircled by massive stone walls, the Aurelian walls that still stand in Rome. Today are a silent reminder of a time when the capital itself was no longer safe. The people were more heavily taxed, the laws were harsher, and the army was larger and more dominant than ever before. Yet, the miracle remained. Against every law of history, the Roman Empire had looked into the abyss and stepped back. It had survived the As the light of the 4th century began to rise, it would bring with it a new capital in the East, and a new religion that would transform the soul of the world. But the foundation of that future was laid by the hard, scarred hands of the men who refused to let Rome die in the dark. The world that emerged from the chaos of the 3rd century was a world of stone and shadow, a place where the old easy rhythms of the Mediterranean had been replaced by a heavy, necessary discipline. As the 4th century dawned, the Roman Empire was no longer a sprawling, open family of provinces. It had become a fortress. At the helm of this transformation stood Diocletian, a man born of humble origins in Dalmatia, who possessed a mind like a master architect. He looked at the vast scarred map of the Roman world and realized that the burden of its defense was simply too great for any one heart to bear. To save the empire, he decided he must divide it. Imagine a map of the world being sliced into 4 distinct quarters, not to separate them, but to hold them more tightly. This was the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. Diocletian appointed a fellow Augustus, and 2 junior Caesars, each responsible for a specific frontier. No longer would the empire wait for a single leader to gallop across continents to face a threat. Now, there was always a light burning in the windows of 4 different capital streets: Milan, Sirmium, and Nicomed. With this new structure came a new kind of majesty. The emperor was no longer the first citizen who walked among the people in a simple toga. He became the dominus, the lord, a figure of distant, divine splendor. Imagine entering the presence of Diocletian. The air is thick with the scent of rare incense. The floors are polished marble, reflecting the flicker of 1,000 candles. And the emperor sits upon a high throne, draped in robes of silk and gold. To approach him, one had to prostrate oneself, acknowledging that the state was no longer a partnership of citizens, but a sacred hierarchy. This rigidity was the price of survival. It brought a much-needed stability to the borders and the economy, but it also created a world that felt more like a machine than a living society, machine fueled by heavy taxes and a massive bureaucracy that touched every corner of a citizen's life. However, the clock of history never stands still, and the intricate system of the 4 rulers began to crumble as soon as Diocletian stepped down. Ambition, that old Roman ghost, returned to haunt the halls of power. From the cold, mystery frontiers of Britain, a new leader emerged, whose name would eventually eclipse even that of the great founders. Constantine, the son of the Caesar Constantius, began his march toward destiny. The turning point of this story, and perhaps the turning point of Western civilization, occurred on a crisp October day in 312 CE at the Milvian Bridge, just outside the walls of Rome. Legend tells us that as the sun began to set, Constantine looked up into the sky and saw a sign of light across, or the interlaced letters of Christ, and heard the words, "In hoc signo vinces, in this sign you shall conquer." Imagine the weight of that moment, a Roman general, heir to the traditions of Jupiter and Mars, turning his gaze toward a small, often persecuted faith that spoke of a kingdom not of this world. Constantine won the battle, and with it, the soul of the empire began to pivot. In 313 CE, through the Edict of Milan, the sound of prison doors opening echoed through the provinces. Christianity was no longer a hidden secret discussed in shadows or catacombs. It was legalized, protected, and soon favored. The emperor, who held the sword of Rome, now sat at the head of church councils, seeking to bring order to the spiritual world, just as he had to the political one. The temples of the old gods still stood, their fires still flickering, but the wind had changed. A new moral architecture was being laid over the ancient stones of the city. But Constantine was not content with merely changing the faith of the empire. He sought to change its very center of gravity. He looked toward the east, to the gateway between Europe and Asia, where the blue waters of the Bosphorus meet the Golden Horn. There stood the ancient city of Byzantium, a place of immense strategic beauty. Constantine realized that Rome, for all its history, was too far from the vital frontiers of the Danube and the Euphrates. So, he embarked on a project of staggering ambition, the creation of a new Rome. Imagine the noise of 10,000 hammers and the dust of 1,000 quarries as a new capital rose from the earth. He called it Constantinople. This was not just a city, it was a statement. It was a Christian capital for a Christian empire, filled with grand basilicas, wide forums, and a hippodrome that could hold 100,000 souls. Constantinople was designed to be impregnable, protected by the sea on 3 sides, and by massive walls on the 4th. As the treasures of the Old World, statues from Greece, obelisks from Egypt, were brought to adorn its streets, the prestige of the old city of Rome began to fade into the soft light of memory. The heart of the empire had moved to the east, to a place where the sun rose over a world that was becoming increasingly Greek in speech and Christian in spirit. The 4th century was a time of grand transitions, a bridge between the ancient and the medieval. It was an era of towering figures like Julian, the last pagan emperor who tried in vain to turn back the tide of history, and Theodosius the Great, who would eventually make Christianity the official religion of the state. By the year 395 CE, as Theodosius lay dying, he made a final, fateful decision to divide the empire between his 2 sons. He believed he was making it easier to manage, but in reality, he was setting the stage for a permanent separation. The map was drawn with a line that would last for 1,000 years, dividing the Latin West from the Greek East. As we rest in the quiet of this late Roman evening, we see an empire that is vastly different from the one Romulus founded or Augustus settled. It is an empire of grand cathedrals and silken courts, of holy scriptures and heavy armor. It is an empire that has learned to survive by changing its skin. The old gods are retreating into the countryside, into the pagonis or rural districts, while the new faith builds its foundations in the heart of the great cities. The late empire was a time of immense pressure and profound transformation, a period where the world was being dismantled and rebuilt at the same time. It was a world that was preparing itself for a long, dark night in the west, even as it kindled a brilliant, enduring flame in the east of flame that would carry the name of Rome, far into a future that the old senators of the Republic could never have imagined. As the final decade of the 4th century drew to a close, the sun began to set on the Roman West with a heavy, melancholic finality. The Great Division of 395 CE had left the empire in 2 halves, but it was the West ruled from the mist-shrouded city of Ravenna and the ancient, tired streets of Rome that found itself shivering in a cold, gathering winter. The unity that had once bound the Mediterranean together was fraying like an old, worn tapestry. Imagine the map of Europe during these years. It was no longer a solid block of Roman red, but a shifting mosaic of movement. From the deep, dark forests of the north and the vast steppes of the east, entire nations were on the move, driven by the terrifying pressure of the Hunza nomadic force of horsemen who seemed to emerge from the very edge of the world. The Germanic tribes began to press against the Roman borders, not as mere raiders, but as refugees seeking a home. In the year 410 CE, a sound echoed across the world that many believed was impossible. The sound of a foreign army breaching the gates of Rome itself. For 3 days, Alaric and his Visigoths moved through the city. They did not burn it to the ground, for they respected the Roman name. But they took its treasures and, more importantly, they took its invincibility. Imagine the shock that rippled through the provinces. In distant Bethlehem, the scholar Jerome wept, writing that the city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. This was a wound to the soul of the empire, a psychological breaking point from which it would never truly recover. The eternal city was no longer a fortress. It was a memory, while the walls were being breached by swords. The foundations of the state were being eroded by a quieter, more persistent decay. The economy of the West was in a state of slow, agonizing collapse. The Great Sea, which had once been a Roman highway, was now haunted by Vandal pirates who had seized the rich grainlands of North Africa. Imagine the markets of Rome, where the bread was once free and plentiful, now empty and silent. The tax base was shrinking as the wealthy aristocrats fled the crumbling cities to their fortified country villas, refusing to pay for a government that could no longer protect them. To fund the army, the state pressed harder on the poor, until many peasants preferred the rule of the barbarian kings to the crushing weight of Roman bureaucracy. The empire was becoming a ghost of itself, a vast, expensive shell with nothing inside to hold it up. Then came the scourge of God, Attila the Hun. Imagine the terror that his name inspired, a force of nature that swept across Gaul and Italy like a wildfire. In 451 CE, at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, a desperate alliance of Romans and Goths managed to turn him back in one of the last great military efforts of the West. But the reprieve was short-lived. A few years later, in 455 CE, the Vandals sailed from Carthage and sacked Rome again, this time with a systematic cruelty that stripped the city of its remaining gold and even the bronze from its temple roofs. The West was now a series of islands in a Germanic sea, a collection of provinces where the Roman name was still spoken, but the Roman power was a fading echo by the middle of the 5th century. The emperors of the West had become shadow rulers, puppets held on strings by Germanic generals like Ricimer and Orestes. These men were the real masters of Italy, commanding armies that were no longer composed of Roman citizens, but of mercenaries who felt no loyalty to the Senate or the ancient eagles. The end, when it finally arrived, was not a grand explosion, but a quiet, almost poetic sigh. In 476 CE, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer decided that he no longer needed a puppet on the throne. Imagine the last emperor, a boy, barely in his teens, with a name that captured the entire span of Roman history. He was called Romulus Augustulus, the little Augustus. In a moment of profound historical irony, the last ruler of Rome bore the names of its first king and its first emperor. Odoacer did not kill the boy. He simply deposed him, stripped him of his purple robes, and sent him to live in a villa in Campania. Odoacer then did something remarkable. He took the imperial regalia, the crown, the scepter, and the robes, and sent them back to Constantinople. His message was simple. There is no longer a need for an emperor in the West. One is enough. With that gesture, the Roman sun in the West finally dipped below the horizon. The long night of the Middle Ages began to settle over the hills of Italy and the plains of Gaul. The paved roads began to crumble. The aqueducts stopped their flow, and the great villas fell into ruin. But even as the political structure vanished, the idea of Rome remained. It lived on in the Latin language of the Church, in the legal codes that the new kings adopted, and in the dreaming spires of the cathedrals that would one day rise from the rubble. The Western Empire had fallen, but the Roman spirit was merely entering a long sleep, waiting to be rediscovered by a world that would never truly forget the glory that once was. while the lights went out across the cities of the West, and the ancient streets of Rome fell into a long, silent slumber under the rule of Germanic kings. The story of Rome did not end. It simply shifted its gaze. In the east, the sun continued to rise over the golden domes and massive marble walls of Constantinople. This was the Eastern Roman Empire, a world we now call Byzantium, though the people who lived there never used that name. To them, they were Romans. They spoke Greek. They worshipped in the grand, incense-filled basilicas of the Orthodox faith, but they carried the law, the administration, and the unyielding pride of the Caesars in their hearts. For another 1,000 years, while Europe navigated the shadows of the Middle Ages, this second Rome stood as a lighthouse of civilization, a bridge between the ancient world and the modern one. Imagine the city of Constantinople in the early 6th century. It was a metropolis unlike any other on earth, a place where the trade routes of the Silk Road met the waters of the Mediterranean. Its markets overflowed with spices from India, silks from China, and furs from the frozen north. At the center of this world sat a man of restless energy and grand vision, Justinian the Firstborn, a peasant in the Balkans. He rose to the throne with a singular, obsessive dream to restore the Roman Empire to its ancient boundaries. He looked toward the lost provinces of Italy, North Africa, and Spain not as foreign lands, but as stolen property that he was divinely ordained to reclaim. Justinian was a man who never slept, a ruler who sought to codify every law, build every church, and win every battle. Beside him sat Empress Theodora, a woman of immense intelligence and courage, who had risen from the ranks of the circus to become the most powerful woman in the world. Together, they embarked on a campaign that would change the face of the Mediterranean. Justinian sent his brilliant general Belisarius to sail across the sea with a fleet of dromons. Imagine the Roman eagles returning to the shores of North Africa, where they dismantled the Vandal kingdom in a whirlwind campaign. Then came the long, grinding struggle for Italy. For nearly 20 years, the peninsula was a battlefield. Belisarius entered the city of Rome, not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, restoring the ancient capital to the authority of the emperor in the east. But the price of restoration was high. The wars drained the treasury, and a terrifying new enemy, the bubonic plague, swept through the empire, claiming the lives of millions, and even bringing Justinian himself to the brink of death. Despite these tragedies, Justinian's legacy was etched in stone and law. He oversaw the construction of the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. Imagine standing beneath its massive dome, which seemed to hang from heaven by a golden chain, its walls covered in mosaics that shimmered like 1,000 suns in the flickering candlelight. He also commissioned the Corpus Juris Civilis, a massive reorganization of Roman law that would become the foundation of legal systems throughout the modern Western world. Justinian had tried to recreate the past, and while his borders would not hold forever, his influence would prove immortal as the centuries passed. The Byzantine Empire became a fortress state, constantly reinventing itself to survive. It faced the rise of Islam in the 7th century, losing the rich provinces of Egypt and Syria, but holding firm behind the impregnable Theodosian walls of Constantinople. It was an empire of high art and deep theology, a place where the emperor was seen as the vicegerent of God on earth. The Byzantines survived through a combination of sophisticated diplomacy, a powerful navy equipped with Greek fire, a mysterious liquid flame that burned even on water, and a cultural prestige that converted the Slavic peoples of the north to their faith. However, the 11th and 12th centuries brought new shadows. The rise of the Seljuk Turks in the east and the growing hostility of the Latin West began to squeeze the empire. The most tragic blow came not from an external enemy, but from fellow Christians. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, an army of Western knights, diverted by Venetian greed, turned their swords against Constantinople. The city that had stood for 9 centuries was brutally sacked, Its treasures were carried off to Venice and Paris, its libraries burned, and its sacred altars shattered. Though the Byzantines eventually reclaimed their capital in 1261, the empire was a broken shell, a ghost of its former glory, ruling over little more than a few islands and the city itself. The final act of this epic drama began in the spring of 1453. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, a young man of 21 with a hunger for history, brought an army of 80,000 to the walls of Constantinople. He brought with him a new and terrifying technology, massive bronze cannons that could hurl stone balls weighing 600 pounds for 53 days. The roar of the cannons shook the ancient walls that had protected the city for over 1,000 years. Inside, the last Roman emperor, Constantine XI, led a desperate defense of barely 7,000 men. He was offered the chance to flee, but he chose to stay, famously declaring, "The city is fallen, and I shall fall with it." On the 29th of May, 1453, the final assault began. The Ottoman soldiers flooded through a small gate that had been left ajar or forced open. The emperor cast aside his imperial regalia, the purple robes and the golden crown, and disappeared into the thick of the fighting, his body never to be found. As the sun set over the Bosphorus that evening, the call to prayer echoed from the minarets of a city that was now Istanbul. The Roman Empire, which had begun with a shepherd on a hill in Italy 22 centuries earlier, had finally come to an end. Yet, as we drift toward the end of our journey, we see that the fall of Constantinople was not a total disappearance. The scholars of the East fled to Italy, carrying with them the ancient Greek manuscripts that would ignite the Renaissance. The laws of Rome, the architecture of the dome, and the dream of a unified world lived on. The Byzantine Empire had been the librarian of the human spirit, holding the light of the classical world through the darkest nights of history, ensuring that when the world was ready to wake up again, the wisdom of Rome would be there to greet it. As the echoes of the last battle in Constantinople faded into the silence of history, and the physical borders of the Roman world finally dissolved, a strange and magnificent transformation began. Rome, the city of brick, marble, and blood, was gone. But Rome, the idea, became immortal. It did not die in 1453. Instead, it seeped into the very soil of the earth, becoming the invisible foundation upon which the modern world is built. To walk through a modern city, to speak a Western language, or to seek justice in a court of law, is to walk in the footsteps of the centurions and the senators. The legacy of Rome is not a collection of dusty ruins. It is the operating system of Western civilization. Imagine, for a moment, the world without the Roman influence. Our maps, our speech, and our very concept of right and wrong would be unrecognizable. The first and perhaps most intimate legacy of the empire is the gift of language. Rome began as a small Latin-speaking village, but as its legions marched, its tongue followed. Today, over 1 billion people speak Romance languages: French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, all of which are direct, evolving echoes of the Latin spoken by Roman soldiers and merchants. Even English, though Germanic in its bones, is saturated with Latin. Nearly 60% of its vocabulary is derived from the language of the Caesars. Every time you speak of liberty, justice, Senate, or republic, you are speaking the language of a people who lived 2,000 years ago. Latin became the universal code of the medieval scholar, the scientist, and the priest, ensuring that the wisdom of the ancients was never truly lost. If language is the breath of Rome's legacy, then law is its skeleton. Before Rome, justice was often a matter of whim, the caprice of a king, or the tradition of a tribe. The Romans changed this forever by insisting that laws must be written, public, and applied to all. From the early 12 tables to the monumental Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian, the Romans developed a sophisticated legal science. They gave us the concept of innocent until proven guilty, the idea of a contract, and the right to trial. They understood that a state is not held together by a man, but by a system of rules that exist independently of who is in power. Modern civil law systems across Europe, Latin America, and parts of Asia are built directly upon the Roman foundation. When a judge enters a courtroom today, they are part of a lineage of justice that stretches back to the Roman praetors who sat in the sun-drenched forum. Then, there is the physical legacy, the mastery of stone and space. The Romans were the world's greatest engineers, not because they invented everything, but because they perfected it. They took the simple arch and transformed it into the dome and the vault, allowing for the creation of vast, open interior spaces that had never been seen before. Imagine the Pantheon in Rome, with its massive concrete dome, a feat of engineering that remained the largest in the world for over 1,000 years. To achieve this, they invented Roman concrete, a material so durable that it can set underwater and survive to millennia of earthquakes and weather. This concrete allowed them to build the aqueducts, colossal stone arteries that carried fresh water across hundreds of miles, a feat of public health that would not be matched until the 19th century. Today, when you see a stadium, a bridge, or a grand government building with its columns and domes, you are seeing the architectural ghost of Rome. But perhaps the most profound legacy is the Roman concept of governance and the citizen. The Romans were the first to wrestle with the idea of a republic, a res publica, or public affair. They experimented with the separation of powers, the use of a senate as an advisory body, and the belief that the people should have a voice through their representatives. The founders of the United States were obsessed with Rome. They looked to the Roman Republic as both a model and a warning. They adopted the names the Senate, the capital, and they sought to recreate the Roman balance of power to prevent the rise of a new Tarquin. The idea that a person belongs to a state not as a subject of a king, but as a citizen with inherent rights and duties, is a Roman gift. It is an idea that has fueled every revolution and every movement for liberty in the last 300 years. Even in the realm of the spirit, Rome's shadow is long. By adopting and then legalizing Christianity, the Roman Empire provided the structure and the roads for a small sect to become a world religion. The organization of the church, its diocese, its hierarchy, and its center in Rome is a direct mirror of the Roman administrative map. The transition from the Roman Empire to Western Christendom was so seamless that for centuries, people did not feel they were living in a post-Roman world. They felt they were living in a Holy Roman one. As we reach the end of our long journey through time, we realize that Rome is not a destination we have left behind. It is the very ground we stand on. We see it in the grid pattern of our cities, we hear it in the rhythm of our ceremonies, and we feel it in our commitment to the rule of law. The Roman Empire did not truly fall. It simply changed its form. It ceased to be an empire of land and became an empire of the mind. Close your eyes now and imagine those 7 hills one last time. The fires of the temples have long since gone out, and the sandals of the legions no longer clatter on the Appian Way. But the silence is not an empty one. It is the quiet of a foundation that holds up the world. Rome is the dream of order, the passion for law, and the belief that a single city can become a home for all of humanity. As you drift into sleep, remember that you are a part of this story. The history of Rome is your history, and its legacy is the light that continues to guide our journey into the future. The eternal city is no longer found on a map. It is found in the heart of every person who believes in the power of civilization.